There are certain moments in your life you remember as milestones, and one such moment in mine was receiving a phone call in the summer of 1968 from BBC producer David Croft, offering me 2 lines as an air raid warden in a new television series called Dad's Army. Until then, I had been involved mainly in radio, summer shows and cabaret, but suddenly I found myself in the company of a delightfully warm group of film, television and stage actors, all of us being in on the start of what was to become one of the great television programmes this country has produced. Dad's Army became beloved by the viewing public and was eventually adapted into a long-running radio series, a stage musical, including an appearance in a Royal Command performance in the presence of Her Majesty the Queen at the London Palladium, and a full-length feature film made by Columbia Pictures. This is not just the story of a successful television series of 80 episodes that were made over 9 years, but also a story about the families and friends of those actors who became legends in their own lifetime. The idea of presenting a programme about the Home Guard was conceived by Jimmy Perry, who had been a member of this corps in his teens before he enlisted in the army. One day in the late 60s, when he was working as an actor in the theatre, he cast his mind back to those days in the Home Guard and thought that the subject might be presented on television. After all, nobody had done it before. Perhaps nobody had thought about it before, or if they had, the idea probably seemed ridiculous. Who would be interested in a television programme about a group of generally senior citizens trying to look like soldiers guarding their country with pitchforks, broomsticks and any other items of domestic hardware they could lay their hands on? But wasn't it the exceptional optimism of those loyal countrymen that might prove to be the catalyst for the television public to latch onto? The original concept of the Home Guard, local defence volunteers, as they were first called, had been deadly serious, even though their weapons were primitive. By 1940, we had been driven out of France and the Low Countries, and the British needed not only material rearmament, but also a psychological uplift. Winston Churchill, who was now Prime Minister in charge of a coalition government, told the British people that they would fight on the beaches and never surrender. When Anthony Eden made his historic speech in June 1940, calling for men under and over the age of active service in the armed forces to form a local defence corps, there was an immediate response from every eligible male in the country. Houses, pubs, village halls and the like became the headquarters of Britain's new fighting force. It says a great deal for the sincerity of the men and their involvement in the war effort that the British people felt that they could sleep easy in their beds at night, with the boys, albeit most of them old boys, watching over them. It was with these thoughts that Jimmy Perry returned home one day in the late 60s and contacted producer-director David Croft, for whom he had worked on a few television programmes, and asked if it would be possible to create a series about the Home Guard. Perhaps Jimmy had remembered a very funny radio comedian called Rob Wilton, very much a Captain Mannering, who in the 1940s had caricatured the Home Guard with his joke that began, "The day I joined the Home Guard, my missus said to me, she said, 'What are you?' Well, I said, 'I'm one of the Home Guard.' She said, 'What do you do?' Well, I said, I've got to stop Hitler's army from landing.' She said, 'Well, just you?' I said, 'Oh, no, there's me and Charlie Evans and well, there's 7 or 8 of us all together.' She said, 'You know this fella Hitler?' I said, 'Of course not.' She said, 'Well, how will you know if it's him, if he lands?' I said, 'Well, I've got a tongue in my head, haven't I?"
Although the BBC programme makers had commissioned Jimmy and Davy to write an initial half a dozen scripts about the Home Guard, there was still some doubt in their minds that a comedy programme based on this subject would prove successful. The then head of variety was Bill Cotton, son of band leader Billy Cotton of Wakey Wakey fame. Dad's Army turned out to be a wonderful surprise to Bill. When David Croft first told him he wanted to do a comedy about the Home Guard, Bill said he was out of his head. He was very grateful he was not heeded. As with all great comedies, Dad's Army had the first qualifications of a smash hit. It was very well written and cleverly cast. Hugh Weldon always used to tell the story of being confused while watching the show being rehearsed. He thought Arthur Lowe would be the sergeant and John the Measurer the officer. He considered reversing it to be a stroke of genius. In later years, Bill Cotton had the enormous joy of travelling to Thetford, where we were all filming, to tell the cast that they had topped the ratings in one particular week with an audience of 21 million.
As with any period television or film production, the initial research is very important. It is a painstaking and arduous business, but never dull and extremely rewarding. In the case of Dad's Army, David Croft, Jimmy Perry and the BBC paid attention to even the smallest detail. Among the details that had to be discussed and researched before even a word of script was written were the sort of clothes that were worn in the 1940s, and vehicles of the period, cars, buses, vans and motorcycles. All the vehicles had to be obtained in a roadworthy condition, as they were to be used in the programmes for real. Cigarette packets, sweet wrappers, newspapers, magazines and hairstyles of the period and the sort of food that was eaten during the war all had to be researched. Wartime recipes were found, most of which were based on simple ingredients and a lot of ingenuity. Most of the foods that were taken for granted before the war were rationed and became extremely scarce, and were obtainable only on the black market, and even then in small quantities. Some typical and popular dishes of that period included fish in savoury custard, pathfinder pudding, carrot jam, pilchard layer loaf, vinegar cake, belted leeks, rabbit surprise, and the best known of all, Woolton pie. These curtailed menus obviously did no harm to the nation's health, because it was a fact that people were healthier in wartime than at almost any other period. A great amount of time was spent on researching the weapons the Home Guard used over a period of several years, from the early broomsticks and pickaxe handles to the later American World War I P-17 rifles, the Chicago gangster-type Tommy guns, and much later the British-made Sten gun, which became a great luxury even though it was in short supply. When they arrived in Britain, the American consignment of weapons were covered in layers of thick grease, as the majority had been in store for years. Not least of the problems to be faced by David Croft and Jimmy Perry was casting the 7 main characters who would feature in the Wilmington-on-Sea Home Guard. The eventual casting was brilliant. The first character to be decided was Captain Mannering. Michael Mills, the head of situation comedy at the BBC at that time, wanted David Croft to seriously consider John Le Mesurier for the sergeant, and with John's long experience in films, this seemed a good idea. Michael also suggested Clive Dunn to play Corporal Jones, and said that John Laurie was available and would be great for Private Fraser, who initially was a retired seafarer in the series, but later became the Wilmington-on-Sea Undertaker. David Croft cast Arnold Ridley, who had worked with him before in television, Ian Lavender, after David's wife saw this young lad in a play, Jimmy Beck, and a certain Bill Pertwee as Air Raid Warden Hodges. It was Michael Mills again who was responsible for renaming the series. Jimmy Perry knew his working title, The Fighting Tigers, was not right, and Michael came up with a brilliant Dad's Army. When we went up to Thetford during the month of June for our annual filming sessions for the series, we would tell our friends and relations beforehand to book their holidays at the same time. In 9 years of filming in Norfolk, we only had 3 or 4 days of bad weather, which included 1 day of snow. So in honour of our co-writer and director David Croft, the sunny days and weeks became known as Croft's weather. It was always a joyous occasion to make the journey to Thetford, where we were based for the exterior work of the series. A coach was laid on at the BBC Television Centre in Wood Lane, London, for anyone who was not going up under their own steam. The wardrobe girls and boys, make-up assistants, most of the extras and 2 or 3 principals usually travelled by coach. The rest of us took our own cars, except John Le Mesurier, who travelled with Clive Dunn and myself, or else went by train from Liverpool Street, changing at Ely. Everyone took their time, generally leaving on Sunday morning and stopping for lunch on the way. Often we would pass each other en route and sometimes stop to have a chat on a country road, to admire the lovely scenery and exchange pleasantries. The production crew, cameramen, lighting and sound technicians, and the special effects department would all have gone on earlier. The gathering of the cast at the hotel in Thetford was a noisy, bustling affair. A room was set aside for the use of the make-up girls and the wardrobe department, and all the costumes had to be carried out of the caravans that had previously arrived from London, towed by Land Rovers. The hotel reception area seemed to be full of bodies, actors asking questions, sorting out their room numbers, and ordering hot buttered toast to accompany the tea, which they could make in their rooms. Frank Williams, the vicar, was usually inquiring whether Teddy, the verger, had brought everything out of the car, while he sorted out the volumes of books and suitcases and other impedimenta he had packed into Teddy's car for the journey from London. Arthur Lowe would immediately inquire if the corner shop still sold Craven cigarettes, as that was the only brand he and his wife Joan smoked. Jimmy Perry would be telling everybody that he had brought his well-worn medicine chest with him, which included Aspro, throat spray, indigestion tablets, Cenopods, diarrhea tablets, malaria pills, snake-bite ointment, shark poison antidote, and a selection of plasters, splints, and spare sets of false teeth, should they be needed by anyone. Other people would ask if their rooms overlooked the river, because they didn't want to face the courtyard, as they did last time, because it was very noisy at night. With a general chorus of "See you in the bar before dinner," the eager actors mounted the stairs brandishing their room keys, while the girls behind the reception breathed a sigh of relief. Early in the series, before the Bell Hotel had tea-making facilities in the rooms, Arthur Lowe would come out onto the landing early in the morning and ask, "Where's the tea boy? Put 2 tea bags in my pot again. He knows I only have 1. The Bell was the main dormitory for the principal actors and guest artists, and the Anchor Hotel, which was just across the river, the secondary accommodation. Both hotels had to cope with many early morning breakfasts, and in some cases at the Bell serve it in the rooms, as actors would be going to the make-up girls in their T-shirts and trousers and only completing their wardrobe call after breakfast. Those of us in the dining room would discuss the news of the day or what scenes we would be filming. Arthur Lowe was generally in deep conversation with the waiter, telling him how he wanted his kippers cooked, or sometimes asking if the cold ham was tender. Suddenly a production assistant would announce that the coach was leaving in 5 minutes, and in an instant actors and crew from both hotels would be congregating in the reception area of the Bell with their equipment, newspapers and other possessions waiting to start the day. It was the job of the production assistant to make sure that everyone got onto the coach for the drive to the location. Those who were not needed for a few hours would be told to relax, and the coach or a unit car would be back to pick them up later. Getting everybody onto the coach was a military operation in itself. Someone had generally forgotten something, for example a pair of boots they thought the dressers had, but now they remembered they'd left them in their room, or a spare T-shirt they wanted to change into at lunchtime. Our destination was the Stamford Battle area, which was marked by the earlier arrival of the wardrobe van, catering bus, and the all-important honey wagon toilets, not to mention various cars, technical equipment, and even, if necessary, Jones' butcher's van and all types of period vehicles. David Croft, who had bought a house nearby, would already be in the process of looking for the right spot to set up the cameras and equipment for the first shot of the day. Officially, the site was called the Stamford Practical Training Area and was a large area of countryside of several square miles, used by the Ministry of Defence for training our own and NATO forces. It had once consisted of small estates that were generally made up of the main house of the local gentry, with perhaps a small farm, a general stores, pub, and in some cases their own church. Nearly all the buildings had been used for army exercises in which battle conditions were simulated with live ammunition, so very little was left of them. Harold Snowd was the first production assistant on the series, and it was he who found and selected the battle area as the main location for the exterior filming. He had a simple arrangement with the army officer commanding the area, Colonel Cleasby Thompson. He gave him a schedule showing where we wanted to film each day, and he kept any troop training away from us. However, on one occasion things went slightly wrong. We were at a stables, filming a complicated sequence with the platoon trying to learn how to ride. Captain Mannering had decided that with strict petrol rationing, the platoon's transport would be equestrian. Suddenly there was a rustle in the bushes alongside the camera, and a young officer in full camouflage uniform, blackened-faced the lot, politely informed Harold that he and his men had orders to blow up this area in 10 minutes. At this, a large amount of frenzied conversation took place, and after Harold had made an urgent phone call to the authorities, it was agreed, with only 3 minutes to go, that they would come back and blow it up the next day. Another sequence on the battle area involved Pike falling into a bog. To achieve this under controlled conditions, so that it would be safe, it was arranged for some soldiers to dig a pit 7 feet by 5 and 6 feet deep, alongside a river which ran through the area. It was possible to flood the river slightly by dropping some sluice gates, which filled up the pit and also gave about an inch of water over the surrounding terrain. Once some cork chips and peat had been floated on the surface, David Croft had just the bog he wanted. Some rostrums were put in the bottom of the pit, and then, as Pike was supposed to be sinking deeper and deeper, while Mannering and the rest of the platoon performed fruitless attempts to try and rescue him, the crew gradually reduced the height of the rostrums, allowing Pike to sink lower and lower. But they reduced them a bit too quickly, and suddenly poor Ian Lavender was standing on tiptoe on the bottom of the pit with water up to his neck. Then the hapless Private Pike suddenly let out a terrible yell and screamed hysterically, asking to be pulled out. When the crew did so, they discovered that a large frog had somehow worked its way up his trouser leg. They all thought it was very funny, but Ian didn't find it quite so amusing. The final saga of the bog sequence came about that evening, after we had all gone back to the Bell Hotel. It was the habit of the helpful army officer in charge of the battle area, the aforementioned Colonel Cleasby Thompson, to walk his dog by the river every evening. He was the sort of man who wore tough knee-high boots, and so thought nothing of strolling through puddles alongside his river. Unfortunately, he had forgotten that we'd been filming the bog sequence and suddenly disappeared up to his neck in dirty water. When Harold went to see him the next day to tell him that the rushes were okay and that the hole could be filled in, he was not in quite his normal cheery mood. But after he and his wife joined us for dinner at the Bell Hotel that evening, all was forgiven. Some of the chase sequences involved a lot of vehicles and were very tiring for everyone concerned, and not just the actors. But the results were usually good, and in the tradition of the old Maxenic comedies. They generally finished with Warden Hodges being flung into a lake or being pushed off a bridge into a river. On one occasion, I, as Hodges, had a mushy type of custard-coloured liquid poured over me from a great height. The warden was supposed to be guiding a spotter plane, which was carrying the custard liquid over to the place where he knew Mannering and his men were hiding. However, the plane dropped its load on top of Hodges by mistake. This sequence was filmed first with the aeroplane flying overhead, and then dustbins full of the liquid were filmed as they were emptied from the top of a high crane to simulate aerial movement. Unfortunately, the liquid quickly went solid and filled my ears, so I had to be taken in a fast car to Thetford Cottage Hospital for treatment. When we arrived, a notice on the gate informed us that it was half-day closing. Eventually, we found a doctor who dealt with the problem using various instruments and a syringe. I also needed a long soak in the bath to get the rest of the liquid off my body. In another episode, Hodges was riding the familiar 1940s motorbike, with the vicar on the pillion and the verger in the sidecar. It was a fairly fast ride into camera shot, but suddenly a mechanical failure caused the machine to go out of control, and the camera and sound crew had to jump for their lives. The vicar's only comment was, "I hope the verger didn't have his usual rubbish for breakfast." In one scene, when we were filming at Lowestoft, the warden saw the lighthouse illuminated and guessed that Mannering's platoon had something to do with it. In fact, they'd been guarding it and Corporal Jones had touched the on switch. So he decided to row out to them. He cut loose a pedalo boat, which had been tied up on the beach at the outbreak of war, and paddled towards the lighthouse. He didn't know that the boats had been holed to stop them being used by an enemy landing force. The idea for the film sequence was that I, as the warden, should get halfway to my objective and then slowly sink. David Croft and the camera crew were on the jetty, filming the action. Suddenly an enveloping mist descended and nothing was visible. The camera crew, myself in the boat, or the shore. The only sound, and it was an eerie one at 2 o'clock in the morning, was the sirens of fishing boats that were trying to find the harbour. By now I was far out to sea, but luckily I was picked up by a diver and guided into the shore. Harold Snoad was on hand to administer large doses of scotch and to get the luckless Hodges back to the hotel in Yarmouth. Very early the next morning I was rehearsing the boat scene again off the Britannia Pier. Although the water looked very calm from high up on the pier, when I was put into the water wearing only my warden's helmet and a flesh-coloured jockstrap, the waves knocked me back onto the girders beneath. The scene required that Hodges should be chased by a sea mine that was attracted to his steel helmet. It was quickly decided to use a stunt double for the scene, and I only had to fall in the water, but it was still very cold. The warden was also in some peril during the Royal Train episode. The Mayor of Warmington, the vicar, the verger and the warden were crowded onto a pump truck trying to stop a runaway railway engine that was carrying Mannering and his lads. The pump truck is like a small platform with 2 levers, which when hand-pumped simply propel it along. The truck was in a small cutting and going very fast in pursuit of the engine when one of the handles caught in my trouser pocket, tore it and began to lift me up in the air. I managed to save myself, but I could easily have gone over the side. The cast of the platoon also had to take care because most of them were crawling about on the engine, complete with a camera crew. Clive Dunn had some hair-raising sequences to do as Corporal Jones. On one occasion he had to climb out onto the town hall roof and try to pull in a German pilot who had bailed out of his aircraft and been caught in the hands of the town hall clock. Some of this was done with trick photography, but the final result was excellent. Another sequence called for Corporal Jones to get caught up on the sails of a large windmill and fly around several times on them. The crew had found a huge windmill which looked very impressive, but it only went round if there was almost a gale-force wind. As they couldn't possibly film in those conditions, a small timber hut was put up between the camera and the windmill. In fact, the hut didn't have a back, and 2 strong scene boys stood behind it and kept the sails turning by giving each of them a shove as the bottom end came past. It worked extremely well. Another difficult episode to make was entitled The Day the Balloon Went Up. The story revolved around a barrage balloon that had broken loose from its moorings and was hovering above the church hall. Mannering organised everybody, even the reluctant Warden Hodges, to take the guy ropes and walk the balloon into open country and wait for the army to come and pick it up. In the exterior filming sequences, the whole platoon plus the warden, vicar and verger are seen holding the ropes. Captain Mannering manages to get his legs caught up in one of the ropes, and when the others panic and let go of their ropes, he goes up with the balloon. The sight of Mannering skimming over the treetops, in reality a stuntman, was quite hilarious. The final scene, in which he is caught under a railway bridge in the path of an approaching train before he is rescued, was in the best traditions of screen comedy. In the early days, the rushes, rough cut of the day's filming, would be put on the train to London and returned next day for us to see. These were viewed at the little local cinema in Thetford after the regular film show finished at night. At 10:30 p.m, a group of actors could be seen walking up the road to the cinema and waiting for the late doors to open. Sequences of the filming were greeted with, "Look at the warden, overacting again," or "So-and-so could have done better than that." A funny sequence would be greeted with spasmodic applause or laughter. Arthur Lowe would generally fall asleep, but wake up at just the right moment to make a cryptic remark. We would then return to our respective hotels for a nightcap or two. Whenever we had to do any filming in the streets of Thetford, it was necessary for the windows of any houses we saw in the background, and this could be quite a large number in some of the platoon marching sequences, to look correct, crisscrossed with brown sticky tape, as they would have been during the war. When the first series was filmed, the crew spent many a long hour trudging up the road, visiting each house with rolls of sticky tape, explaining what was wanted, and often having to do the job themselves. This was far too time-consuming, so when the second series came along, duplicated copies of a letter would drop through their letterboxes, explaining what was wanted, with a diagram of a typical finished window, along with a roll of brown sticky tape and a pound note for their trouble, and everybody obliged. One day, several old vehicles were lined up in the street ready for filming, when a traffic warden appeared and told David Croft that he couldn't park the vehicles on a yellow line. David explained that we were filming and would be as quick as possible. The traffic warden looked at one of the old vehicles, an Austin 7, and said, "By the way, the tax disc is out of date. It's showing 1940. At breakfast one morning at the hotel, we learned from the newspaper that Clive Dunn had been awarded an OBE. Clive was already in makeup, and we wouldn't be able to see him until we got on the coach. Arthur Lowe was tucking into his breakfast, and someone asked him what he thought about Clive being awarded an OBE. Arthur looked up, put down his knife and fork, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Very good. When it comes to my turn, I don't want any of that bargain basement stuff." I hope I'm not speaking out of turn when I say that I think Arthur was overdue for some recognition at the end of the series. John the Measurer always amused me. On one occasion he said to me, "I don't want to eat in the hotel tonight. Let's go and get some fish and chips, Billy." He always called me Billy. So we drove out of Thetford and found a fish and chip shop. I told him we couldn't eat them in the car as they would leave a terrible smell. We drove on until we found a bus shelter on a lonely stretch of road. Sitting in the shelter eating our fish and chips in the fading light of the evening, John turned to me and said, "Our programme's watched by 20 million people. If only the public could see us now, up to our elbows in batter in a bus shelter in Norfolk." Harold Snowd remembers an instance when we were filming on a very hot day and John looked at his watch and found that it had stopped. He said, "This heat is really awfully exhausting. Could someone wind up my watch for me, please?" The social highlight of our stay in Thetford was a visit sometimes, more than one, to David and Anne Croft's house for a large Sunday lunch. All the children, from toddlers to teenagers, were there, and also Anne's parents, who lived in a bungalow that had been converted from part of the main farmhouse. David and Anne were the ideal hosts, and the table would groan under the weight of food and wine, all of which was accompanied by great conviviality. Saying goodbye to Thetford for another year was always tinged with sadness, for we had become attached to it over the years. I asked Arthur Lowe a few years after we had finished making the series whether he would like to return to Thetford, and he replied, "No, it holds too many ghosts for me," and I know what he meant. It may surprise some people to know that during the 9-year run of the series, many guest artists appeared in the show. There were some who appeared in several episodes, and others who made regular appearances. One of them, of course, was Janet Davis, who played Mrs. Pike, the stupid boy's mother. Janet looked like a pretty housewife, someone you would want to come home to, which was exactly what she was intended to be, and in a very discreet way the comforter of Sergeant Wilson. Mrs. Pike's continual concerns that Frank should not get cold on night duty, that he should have enough to eat, and that he should always have his scarf with him, were typical of any fussy mother. Mavis would burst into the church hall on parade nights and let fly at Mannering with, "My boy's not going to be out all night and then get up for work at the bank in the morning." I mean, what about his chest? He's always been delicate since he had the croup. And then quietly say to Sergeant Wilson on her way out, what about you, Arthur? Will you be in for your cocoa at the usual time? Which would bring the familiar response from Wilson, oh, please, Mavis. And then he would dismiss her with a gentle wave of his hand. The way that the situation between Wilson and Mrs. Pike was handled appeared to leave little to the imagination, but it was written so well, and Janet played it so skillfully, that it took some time for the general public to realise the significance of their conversation. The viewers at home liked to think that they had discovered a clandestine relationship, although it was never confirmed. Mannering occasionally referred to it when he and Wilson were having a quiet tete-a-tete in the office, but even then there was only a slight suggestion in his questioning, and certainly no conclusions were drawn from it. Another was Pamela Cundell, Corporal Jones' friend, Mrs. Fox, who he eventually married in the final episode. It was a pleasant surprise to know that she would be playing Mrs. Fox in the series, a character who was to become a fairly regular visitor. The sight of Mrs. Fox would make Corporal Jones, who ran the butcher shop in Warmington, become weak at the knees. She played on his romantic emotions for a little favour or two, an extra lamb chop or sausage, over and above her weekly meat ration. In spite of her little wiles, Mrs. Fox was a homely and endearing lady, which made the character real. Pamela Cundell's portrayal of the character was very convincing because she herself is a sincere and warm-hearted person. In one episode, Mrs. Fox is invited to the Marigold tea rooms by Captain Mannering, who wants to explain to her that Corporal Jones is not concentrating on his home guard duties because of his infatuation for her, and that he, Jones, believes that Mrs. Fox is flirting with someone else, which he is inclined to do occasionally. However, Mrs. Fox thinks Mannering has invited her to the tea rooms to engage in pleasantries himself, perhaps to ask her to take a port and lemon with him one evening, and to make some sort of flirtatious advances towards her. The playing of this scene could have been very heavy-handed, but with Arthur Lowe's usual deft touch as Mannering, and the misreading of the situation by Mrs. Fox, as played by Pam, it became a joy to watch. Felix Burness made the transition from one or two appearances in Dad's Army to being a regular character in Perry and Croft's successful series Hi-de-Hi. When Felix came to the filming sessions in Norfolk, he laughed at the scenes being rehearsed while he was waiting to take his own part, not realising that this was against the rules, for laughter was the studio audience's job. Felix was told to go away and be quiet, so he climbed up a tree and sat in the branches and started to imitate a bird call. Nobody knew that he had done this at the time, and when the episode was shown, people believed that there had been a songbird somewhere within earshot of the microphones. John Clegg became one of the stars of It Ain't Half Hot Mum after he featured in a Dad's Army episode entitled The Great Big Wheel. This episode was based on some true facts. During the war, an inventor suggested the idea that huge wheels, similar to those at fairgrounds, could have rockets fixed to them, and in the eventuality of a German invasion force landing in this country, the wheels, which would be radio-controlled, would be manoeuvred into position and then directed across the beaches, firing their rockets at the enemy landing forces. Members of the wartime cabinet and high-ranking military personnel attended the demonstration, but it went slightly wrong. The huge wheels could not be controlled properly and went into reverse, scattering the onlookers. The events of this story became the basis of the Dad's Army episode, in which John Clegg played the absent-minded radio operator. Wendy Richard was in several as Private Walker's girlfriend, and Carmen Silvera, of her Low Hello fame, was in Mum's Army, where she had a very poignant scene with Mannering on a railway station, on Our Brief Encounter. Nigel Hawthorne played a tramp in one episode, and Fulton Mackay, who was so superb in Porridge, also joined the guest list, as did Philip Maddock, who played the German U-boat commander in the hilarious Deadly Attachment episode. It was a wonderful piece of situation comedy. A German U-boat had sunk, and the crew, including its commander, Philip Maddock, was drifting towards the coast at Warmington-on-Sea in a rubber dinghy. Eventually they were captured by Mannering and our gallant boys and marched under armed guard to the church hall to await a full military escort to a secure prisoner of war camp. It should have been a straightforward operation, until, that is, the air raid warden started to interfere. Mannering was told by his commanding colonel to keep the prisoners in the church hall for the night and to give them some food. Send out for some fish and chips if you haven't any food in the hall. This led to the hilarious scene in which Private Walker was ordered to go to the fish and chip shop. Walker had to take the orders for the prisoners' meals, and the U-boat commander said that he wanted plaice and nothing else. Walker said, "Right, I've got 7 cod and 1 plaice so far." He then asked who wanted chips and who wanted vinegar, etc. The commander replied that he wanted nice crispy chips, not soggy ones. Mannering suddenly realised that the situation was getting out of hand and said, "You'll have what you're given. If they say you'll eat soggy chips, you'll eat soggy chips." The air raid warden then entered and completely confused the situation, as he always did. The performance of Philip Maddock was a lesson in underplaying, which made the character of the German U-boat commander even more sinister. The handsome and elegant 50s film star Edward Underdown was a very welcome addition on a couple of occasions. So too were the many appearances by those fine actors Robert Raglan and Geoffrey Lumsden. We were certainly all very thrilled when ex-England cricketing legend Freddie Truman joined us in the episode The Test. We had a hilarious few days with Fred on location in the Norfolk countryside. Fred arrived in Thetford for the exterior sequences on one of the very few rainy days we encountered. The character E.C. Egan had been engaged by the air raid wardens to play in the challenge match against Mannering's Home Guard unit. He was their secret weapon. The match was played and filmed on a disused army sports field complete with the pavilion. Although the ground was rough, Freddie made the ball come through at an alarming rate. During his career, he had been the first bowler ever to have taken 300 test match wickets, and we all felt that we were lucky not having to face him in his heyday.